I need to contextualize the project as a whole, very briefly. It's just 2 paragraphs from my book, from my introduction. I think it's important to note that the phenomena that we're looking at here, right, from the kind of explicit Islamic communism of the early 1920s that you see in this slide, very clear, very direct in your face. It was a more idealistic time, right? Oops. Sorry, is it back? Okay, thank you. Okay, so the phenomena studied here from the explicit communism of the 1920s to the various kinds of confluences of Islam and socialism that we see with Masyumi in the 1950s. These are actually significant, ultimately, to me, at a personal level, because they are understudied instances of progressive Islam. I know that's a very contested term, and I know we can talk about it later in Q&A if you like. It can mean different things to different people. But I quite like Carol Kirsten's formulation for progressive Islam. He calls it a Muslim discourse which seeks to navigate between outright secularism, bland traditionalism, and uncompromisingly literalist interpretations of Islamic teachings. And I think that's about as good a definition as any, right? That doesn't really try to use an outside standard by which to judge whether or not Islam is progressive, without trying to look to the, say for example, Western cultural norms about tolerance, for example, to judge whether or not Islam is progressive. I think the formulation that Carol Kirsten uses is a sensible one, and we see this articulation of progressive Islam come out multiple times through multiple societies throughout the 20th century. We see it with Mirsaid Sultan Galiev, the Tatar Muslim communist in the USSR, right? And we also see it, and this was very early, this is the 1910s, 1920s. Tan Malaka actually attended one of his classes at KUTV, the Soviet University for Peoples of the Far East, during the, I believe it was 1919 or around then when he was in Moscow. But we also see it prop up much closer to Indonesia in places like East Pakistan. So this is before the War of Liberation in which Bangladesh broke away in 1971. We see it with Maulana Bashani, sometimes called the Red Maulana of East Pakistan, who was actively and very successfully organizing peasants and organizing sharecroppers in particular to fight for their labor rights in East Pakistan. And my friend Leliuddin is really the expert on this particular topic. So these interpretations of Islam emphasize socioeconomic justice and equity, and they have surfaced far too often for scholars to ignore them as a cohesive phenomenon. So I really am an Indonesia specialist, but I'm aware that this is something that we see in different parts of the world. Now, I think the cognate, the sensible counterpart is liberation theology in Latin America. Right. So, as with liberation theology in Latin America, leftist interpretations of Islam, they deserve, I think, serious scholarly attention, whether they manifest in Iran or Egypt, whether in Pakistan or Indonesia. And there's a strong tendency, I think, to dismiss Islam's conciliation with Marxism during the 20th century as syncretic or eccentric, or kind of a result of a cynically instrumentalist way to manipulate Muslims, right? And I think this is really part of Orientalism's long shadow. Of course, I'm thinking of Edward Said here. And this is something that's further distorted by the ideological lenses of the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, you had to choose sides. Are you with America? Are you against America? Are you with the Soviet Union? Are you against the Soviet Union? And that doesn't really allow us to see the complex identities and complex motivations that people had. Now, on top of that, I think it's worth saying that for those of us who live in, shall we say, formerly colonized societies, right? I think the concept of the third world is a complicated one, so I prefer formerly colonized societies. Hoping to escape the, shall we say, long ontological shadow of imperialism, we have to do, or we have to engage in what Chen Guanxing, a famous scholar in Taiwan, has called critical synthesis, right? Which is to say, either we adapt the ideas that circulate out there, right? Or we are stuck. Either we accept the legacy of the colonizers' intellectual hegemony, right? Which, frankly, Singapore, where I'm from, is all about that, with some exceptions. But anyway, or we continuously seek a new incarnation of an imagined, glory era, an imagined kind of halcyon period that preceded colonization. So I think that's what I see these people that I study, that's what I see them doing. They are making an attempt to take the best ideas that Europe or America or East Asia has to offer, right? And to merge them with indigenous traditions in Indonesia, indigenous traditions of help, indigenous traditions of care and support for one another, indigenous traditions of compassion. And it's not an easy project. What they did, it was not perfect. Is it intellectually watertight? No, by no means. But I find that aspiration deeply moving, romantic even, if you like. And while the anti-communist massacres of 65 and 66, or what in Indonesia is called G30S, those shut the door on the overt political conciliation between Islam and Marxism in Indonesia. I think, it's obvious enough that Muslim progressivism and progressive Islamic ideas continue to have something of a presence in Indonesian intellectual life. And I hope that the research that I've done in this book, helps kind of open people's minds to the possibilities or different modalities, or put simply, different ways of being Muslim or being a pious Muslim that are possible. We have historical precedents for all kinds of different modalities of being that we don't generally understand or talk about today. Okay, so moving on. This is my first slide. Does anyone know who's in that picture? The two old men, if you had to guess. Anyone? Sorry? Siapa? Haji Misbah. Haji Misbah is the illustration, yeah, on the left side. What about the other picture? Anyone? So this is from David Jenkins' recent book, The Young Suharto, right? Because Jenkins was an Australian journalist who spent a lot of time with, I don't have time to go into David Jenkins. Anyway, he took this picture, right, and it was printed in his book. I got his permission to republish it. This is Semawan and Darsono as old men. So if you know anything about the sort of rise of Indonesian communism, the early days of Indonesian communism, these two guys are the very young. I think they started at like 16, right? They are the very young leaders of the Indonesian communist movement in Semarang, where they worked with the Tram and Railways Union. And they were very successful organizers, and they went on to have very long careers. But for the purposes of history, even amongst academic historians, these two guys, they kind of drop off the radar. We stop hearing about them. VSTP. Vereniging Spoor Tramway? Yeah, personeel, something like that. So anyway, these two guys, they are really the kind of, like really the fathers of the communist movement in Indonesia. And interestingly, they both, they never stop seeing the point of Marxist critiques and Marxist ideas. It always remains important to them, but they both leave the Communist Party by the time the revolution is over. Neither of them wants to have anything to do with the Communist Party. And so that's a really interesting story in its own right. It's the subject of an article that I have coming out in the Journal of World History, I think in a month or two. I just wanted to show you this image today as a way of reminding you of how these three men in particular, I think, kind of tend to be the focus of of historians' attention when it comes to looking at the Indonesian left. So many of the major historical works of scholarship, most famously Ruth McVeigh's The Rise of Indonesian Communism, are concerned with these people, right? And these three men, there are a few others, obviously Aidit and Tan Malaka kind of become a big part of the picture a bit later on. But these guys, in conjunction with Aidit and Tan Malaka, basically monopolize the history, right? They are the focus of the attention. But if we look a bit further, if we try to sort of cast our net wider than beyond these famous individuals, we see a remarkable diversity, a remarkable plurality of a discourse that mixes Islam and communism in this period. It changes over time, okay? So at least during the 1920s, there is this discernibly, specifically Islamic communism, right? That is visible during this period. And Haji Misbah, this guy, the hammer and sickle, probably the most, obvious illustration of that. This image is very on the nose. So I bring you to my first chapter, which really focuses on the pre-1926, specifically Islamic communist newspapers. And oh dear, the text didn't show up very well. Okay, not to worry, you can see most of it, I think. So you just look at the places where these newspapers are published, right? And I use a simple mapping software to sort of, illustrate where these newspapers are published on a map. it's really throughout the major islands of Indonesia. We even have evidence of this going on in Sulawesi. But I wasn't able to find a Sulawesi newspaper, so I didn't include Sulawesi in this map. But we see from Aceh all the way to Semarang, there's a range of different places where these specifically, clearly Islamic communist newspapers, right, are being published and are being read. So we have, I think, thinking back to the first slide, we have the one I use the most, called Jago Jago, or The Champion, published by Haji Datuk Bato and Natar Zainuddin, those two gentlemen in my first slide. Okay, and we also have, Sinar Hindia, which is published in Semarang by Darsono, one of the two old men that you saw on the previous slide. We have all kinds of other papers, including Haji Misbah's Medan Muslimin in Solo, or Surakarta. We have a newspaper called Halilintar, which means lightning, in Pontianak, in Kalimantan. So we really have a very wide range of places and people publishing these newspapers. Okay, let's look at an example of one of these clearly Islamic communist newspapers, right? So this one is called Dunia Merdeka. This is in Purwokerto, right, in Java. And you can get a sense of the kind of design of this newspaper, right? And the byline, or the subtitle, is Hai Rakyat Seluruh Dunia Bersatulah, right, which is Workers of the World Unite. And if you know anything about Communist Manifesto, this should be a familiar sound, right? This should be a familiar sentence. You could call it a shibboleth if you like. It doesn't actually use the word communism. It doesn't actually use Marxism anywhere, but it's a very clear sense of where they're coming from, right? Now, sorry for the slide being so wordy, but I think it's better than me reading it and you struggling to listen. So in Dunia Merdeka, we see articles like the one from 15 February 1924, where the author, anonymous, very often the authors are anonymous because they don't want to go to jail. So the anonymous author writes, "Who has caused this suffering? None other than the aforementioned capitalist," and the Indonesian word used is kaum modal, whom we can call the visible devils, the destroyers of the world. Their origin is the devil, or shaitan, of capitalism, who satisfies his hawa nafsu. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure actually most of you do, the idea of hawa nafsu is the idea of the sort of base desires of humanity, right? So it also writes in another article from March 1924, "Nafsu's servants, the devil and his demons, continuously tempt the people of God, true humanity, and this wily nafsu is not brave enough to murder in broad daylight, and instead murders subtly, such that the murdered do not even feel that they have been killed. Nafsu's realm is expansive, and even the mightiest kings of the world are under his flag. Who is Nafsu? Verily the kings of finance, the aforementioned capitalists." Right? And of course the point here is a kind of allusion to a spiritual death, right? You might not die in person living in a capitalistic and imperialistic world, but you suffer in poverty and you don't even know what causes your suffering, is the point that the author is trying to make here. And the last one, which I find maybe the most fantastical, but still very useful for illustrating my point. In the April 1924 issue, again an anonymous author writes, "In Constantinople, or today Istanbul, what religion do people profess there? Right? Unlike you," very aggressive, "they profess an Islam that is revolutionary. In Egypt, communists who profess Islam are plenty. In Bukhara, which is now governed by Soviets, there exists a popular communist government. Do you see? And what is their religion in Bukhara? In Persia, which already has populist government, what is their religion?" Now this is clearly pretty romantic, right? It's not all that amazing in Istanbul or Bukhara, but I think the fact that there is this aspiration, this idea that a Muslim democratic government can be revolutionary, can be radical, and that's a good thing, right, in the eyes of these people who are publishing Dunia Merdeka. Dunia Merdeka, by the way, means free world. Okay, I think the fact that it is desirable in their eyes that they're looking far away from Indonesia, looking at other Muslim societies and saying, "Hey, why don't we have what they have? Why can we not develop something like this too? Right? Why do we have to remain colonized by the Dutch?" And I think that is a very compelling and very, in many ways, a shock to the system. Because you have to remember, in all these colonial societies, whether we're talking about Vietnam, whether we're talking about Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, these were very the habitus, as Muscadet was saying just now, is deeply dependent. It is the habitus of dependency. It is the habitus of a lack of self-respect. It is the habitus of we are not ready, because that's what the Dutch will tell you constantly. You are not ready to be free, right? You Malays are not ready to be free. You Vietnamese, you are not ready to be free. You are civilizationally backward, right? And of course, I'm thinking of Syed Hussein Alatas and a lot of the epistemological violence that's inflicted on colonized peoples. And for them, as early as 1924, to be saying this, why not? Why can we not be a revolutionary Muslim society like these other Muslim societies in the rest of the world? I think that's a really cosmopolitan perspective that is very shocking in many ways to the Indonesian reader of the time. Okay, but of course that's my interpretation based on my reading of sources. Okay, so let's go on to another newspaper called Halilintar in Pontianak in Kalimantan or Borneo, the island of Borneo, right? And this one's really interesting because the subtitle, instead of Kaum Buruh Bersatulah, is really is Suara Rakyat Umum. Sorry. What does it say? This part. You see in English, right before the article begins, it says, our aim is equality of ownership of land, and it's attributed to Dr. Sun Yat-sen, right? And it's translated in bahasa next to it, maksud kita bersama hak milik atas bumi, right? And that's of course a very idealistic thing to aspire to, but nevertheless, I think very compelling one. It must have been a very compelling message, and fundamentally not so different from the Soviet rallying cry of peace, land, and bread, right? Which is the kind of slogan aspect of the Russian Revolution in 1917. And it really again gives you the sense that Indonesians are looking far from home, not just to Muslim societies, but to other colonized and semi-colonized Asian societies like China, like the Philippines, to look for examples that they can draw on, to find, if you like, historical case studies that will be relevant to Indonesia, right? This is how they're doing it. This is the new society that they are reshaping in China after the fall of the Chinese Empire. What do we have to learn from them? And I think it's very revealing that there's this kind of cosmopolitan, adaptive, pedagogical mindset. Okay, so to just give you a sense of the kind of articles Halilintar is publishing, also very aggressive. Are there Partai Syarikat Islam leaders who truly understands communism's true goals? Of course, this is a rejection of criticism from Syarikat Islam. Why are they brave enough to blindly berate the communist path? Is communism incompatible with Islam? Does communism teach bestiality? Communism is the path of sama rata, sama rasa, same level, same feeling. Does communism weaken the unity of Syarikat Islam? Is communism a product of Moscow? Because of this, communism has no place in the Indies? This slander heaped on communists serves only to throw dust in the eyes of misguided people. Have these reactionaries ever provided proof that communism is against Islam? No, communism in both theory and practice seeks to create a humane world. So this is the kind of argument for compatibility that is being made in this period. Very, very explicit, very clear. And this will change over time. It won't continue to be like this. And it has to do with the time. This is what, 1924, right? This is very soon after the Russian Revolution. This is very soon after Kemal Ataturk in Turkey. This is very soon after Sun Yat-sen's Revolutionary Party overthrows the Qing monarchy in China. This is, a particularly a time of ferment, if you like, and there are many idealistic sentiments that go with that ferment. But what I find most compelling is actually the rhetorical question: is communism a product of Moscow? And that is clearly meant to signal to the reader: no, communism is not a product of Moscow. Communism is something that people adapt. Communism is something that people find relevant to their society by reading communist thinkers like Marx or Bukharin. It is not necessarily whatever Lenin tells us to do. And I think that kind of independent-minded spirit is evident from a very early stage in the Indonesian anti-colonial project. Right? That's it. Other articles in this newspaper would also do things like urge readers to follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad. And that is, of course, a very normal and, shall we say, almost forgettable thing, right? Maybe in a Muslim newspaper. But in a newspaper like this, which urges the equality of ownership of land, to then have a line in an article saying no need to follow the example of the Prophet, I think it's very revealing. Right? Okay, finally, one last paper before we move on to the second chapter. There is a newspaper called Jago Jago. I will turn you to the image that we opened the presentation with today. Sumatra Thawalik School was based. So this is Minangkabau area. I don't really have time to get into the Minangkabau today, but I think it is worth pointing out that Minangkabau seems to have been particularly into this mixing of Islamic and Marxist ideas more than so
sebagai Muslim, no longer kita pun sebagai Marxis. So I think that's from me. I think we can discuss it.
Thank you very much, Mas Gede and Mas Azhar, for a very intriguing questions and responses. But before you respond, we can give the question and answer sessions to the discussion, to the participants here. Okay, there are how many people? 1, 2, 3.
Check. Yeah, thank you very much for the time. Okay, first of all, I just want to introduce myself. I'm M. Furqan from Faculty of Educations. I'm not the members of political faculty, so I don't have any backgrounds about the political readings. But I just want to talk as society's perspective as in Indonesia, because you have mentioned some historical stages in your analysis, explaining about how Islam, communism, and Marxisms developed together in our country, Indonesia, Republic of Indonesia. But I'm talking as a society. Did you also assess or see the response from the society about how they respond toward the communism and also Marxisms? Because currently, or even a past time ago, when I talk to my grandfather, the moment I talk about the concept of communism or Marxism is quite sensitive. They tend to be like Marxism and communism is a new religions, and so contradicted with Islam. And I don't see what actually was happened at the time that make societies of Indonesia really responded to what these values or this concept of Marxism and also communism. Because some also assume that Marxism is a modern forms of communisms. They think that there's an equality between the Marxism and communism actually, and they tend to be anti-communism and Marxisms when we agree with the concept, meaning that you are not Muslim at the time. And even nowadays, when I talk to my friends, to my fathers, to my families, once I mention the terms communism, it tends to be like, oh, you are not Muslim. So it's not good for you to mention the words, or even to discuss or to debate it about the communism points of view. However, in my understanding, many years ago in our what's called country, Indonesia, in the political fields, I also see there's a generic developments of this concept of communism inside of the political members in Indonesia, even until right now. Sometimes we don't have an identity whether or not we are in Marxism or whether or not we are in the communism. Sometimes we tend to be half Marxism and half communism, depends on the voters, even on the voter target. So that I think that until now Indonesians haven't classified or haven't defined their identity, especially in the political platforms, as what kinds of values. It is interesting to talk about the topic Islam, Marxism, and the making of the Nusantara Republic. Currently, we have Islam Nusantara. We have we always talk about Pancasila. Sometimes this ideology doesn't even reflect the main ideas of which is whether it is Marxism or even the communisms. And as an Indonesian, I think that what should we define? even some scholars of Islam also tend to be more progressive compared to people currently. They tend to be more conservative in seeing those concepts correlated to Islam as the identity of Indonesia. Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice presentation, by the way, Dr. Lin. Your upcoming book, I think will really help me because I'm actually my thesis. I just finished my MA thesis last July, and it talks about the party sustainability of the PKI and the Communist Party of the Philippines. Because well, I'm a Filipino, so. My first question, based on your presentation, which stems more about the historical perspective of the ISDV and its connection and its link with the Communist Party of Indonesia, it's more like the connection of the Muslim networks of the Communist Party is more has an emphasis more on its early years rather than during pre-1965 Indonesia. So my question is, does the growth of the PKI as the largest non-ruling communist party of the world was still impacted by the Muslim or any religious networks by its time, or more of its benefit from the NASACOM framework, since Sukarno is more of not really a communist but more on communist leanings? It's securing his political interest in the palace. Second, I would like to be clear about Marxism. Well, basically by Karl Marx, since he has this quote like, religion is the opium of the masses. I would like to be clarified because it is always brought up that Karl Marx is an atheist, but actually that quote has a continuation. Allow me to read. Religion is the opium of the masses. In continuation, it is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of our heartless, and the soul of our soulless condition. So if you will continue the quote, which is not cut from the religion is the opium of the masses, basically Marx is like saying that, like religion for now is still permissible and it can be a tool for humans because basically people are kind of insecure that they won't go to afterlife. So basically it's just fine for us to suffer here and well do some goodness based on our moral compass. So in retrospect, does communist principles really adhere to the abolition of organized religion per se? Or if ever, well, in the last stage of the world per the Communist Manifesto, we are now in capitalism and we can now go to full-blown communism. Is it a place where religion is non-existent, or it is something per the principle of dialectic materialism wherein it is not yet can be concluded or can be reached by our rational mind of the people? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Wafa Hussain. I am the student of political science in the Faculty of Social Sciences, UIII. I would like to ask a question about what are the major contentions between Islamic and Marxist ideologies in the formation of a welfare state. Thank you.
Major what? Contentions. But okay. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. These are some really great observations and questions, and it's a really nice discussion. Thank you so much for having me here again. Maybe I'll try to address Mas Gde's first question about the mobilization, the mobilization of people and its relevance, the continuing relevance or lack thereof, right, of Islam and Marxism, or a combination of Islam and Marxism today. And I think that is in many ways the million-dollar question. Why should we care? What does it matter if it has no resonance, right? And as I sort of began to formulate an answer to your question, I think over lunch today, I realized, I think for me, I have to admit, I'm a historian, not an activist, right? I have a sort of historical perspective, although as an individual, I do care about the activism. But I'm, like, shall we say, not experienced in the tactics and ways and strategies of activism the way Mas Azhar would know much more than me. But from my limited historical perspective, I do feel that, the label that you put on proletarian consciousness doesn't really matter, right? You can call it what you like. You can call it working class consciousness. You can call it a people's movement. You can call it revolutionary mobilization. You call it whatever you like, but the question is, can you get people out to work together? Can you get people out on the street to protest? Can you get people to strike? Can you form unions? Can you cooperate, right? And from that point of view, I think the motivations for that kind of cooperation, that kind of bersama, ya, bergantung, yeah, it's complex, and it actually is subject to fashions. It comes and it goes, it ebbs and it flows. So if you look at, I'm like you, I did my PhD in the US, so I'm thinking of very American examples here. If you think about Occupy Wall Street, right, that is one way of mobilizing people against capitalist predation and also the fundamental, shall we say, insecurity of the market, right? That has very little to do with Marxist critiques of capital. It's not very consciously, used by people mobilizing for Occupy Wall Street. It is the rage of the 99%. I mean, that's the way they would phrase it, right? But is it a legitimate form of mobilization that has revolutionary potential, that has progressive potential? Yes, I would argue it does, right? You see similar things going on right now in this wave of unionization and successful union strikes across the US. Is it, drawing on FDR's New Deal? Is it drawing on Marxist critique of capital? Not really. I mean, sure, there are graduate students in universities who know these things, but for the ordinary workers who just fought Starbucks, right, who just fought Amazon, and who just successfully fought Chrysler, General Motors, and Ford for a better deal, and for electric car plants, good union jobs in electric car plants, which is maybe a consideration that Indonesia may soon have. For people like that, these are very real forms of mobilization. They don't say Marx, they don't say communism, but what are they doing, right? Is it a legitimate form of revolutionary mobilization? I would say yes, it's a step in a good direction. I don't have any grand ambitions for this book. I don't think it's going to shape anyone's consciousness, but I do think that that potential, right, is still there. It may not manifest in the same form. It may not take on the same labels of like Islamic Marxism, Islamic communism, but in substance, is it moving towards something better, right? Is it countering the effects of capital? Sure, I would say yes, it's possible. Yeah. So it's a very half answer, I'm aware, but it's the best that I can do. Yeah. Okay, so let me move on to Mas Azhar's very, I think, tepat, right? Very pointed observations. So I think the first one about sort of how people don't question why, like, is Islam and capitalism compatible? Like, is it really okay that we invest in the stock market or we like gain interest in our bank accounts? So, like, is this really all right? Right? Is this riba? Who knows? We'll see. I think that's a very legitimate and very pointed observation. That is true, and that has to do with hegemony. And here I'm drawing really directly on Antonio Gramsci, and the idea that this is the world that we grew up in. Like, we grew up in a world where it's basically impossible to imagine not putting your money in a bank. Sure, you could choose Islamic finance as an alternative, but these are basically workarounds, right? This is playing with fiqh rather than, the sort of the mutton, the core, right? The core of Islamic jurisprudence, which is meant to redirect you away from this money lending for profit. I mean, the whole point is no money lending for profit, right? The whole point is something like microfinance, non-for-profit, not for profit. But in the case of the world we live in, it's so fundamental, it's so difficult to operate without a card, right? Without plastic. It's so difficult to operate without a bank account. It's so nearly impossible that we all just get kind of drawn into it. and we barely question it. And I think that is the long ontological legacy of the Cold War. And you're quite right that in the 1950s, this was a genuine question that people were asking. So Natsir, Muhammad Natsir, one of the key ideologues of Masyumi, actually has a number of books. I think it's two different books that explores this question. And he's very, 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 really rejects capitalism. He's like, this is terrible. Look at where Western capitalism has brought the European empires. What has it made them into? And he doesn't say that there's nothing to learn from Europe, right? He doesn't reject Europe. He doesn't reject America. He says, you guys have good intellectual contributions, but look where the way you organize your societies has brought you. It has made you monsters. It has made you swallow the entire world in your quest for profit, right? So I think that is a fundamental difference between, you know, the 1950s and today, right? That's such a almost impossible for us to imagine kind of level of difference. We're not even having that conversation anymore, right? And I don't know how we begin having it. Hopefully this is one small way in which we begin having it, okay? So on your second question of complacency, right? Did the left and the right sort of get complacent and sort of fall apart, no longer need to work together? I would say that you are quite right to say that circumstances dictated the left and the right had to work together, especially during the revolution. But there are fundamental points of compatibility, right? There are certain shared values, I would say. Maybe not shared goals necessarily, because the goals of communism are this classless utopia, right? So maybe not shared goals, but shared values, certainly. And I think those values are built on compassion, ultimately. It is the compassion for the poor, it is the compassion for the struggling, right? It is the compassion for the disabled, the weak, the whatever. And that's something that's very deep in Islam, that spirit of compassion, right? And I think it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that the spirit of compassion also moves Marxism, that it's a really big part of it. It does not simply, I mean, sure, it's grand historical theory, right? But it is fundamentally concerned with how do we do better? Do we leave things the way they are? Right? It is a message of hope. It is the way Martin Luther King put it, right? The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We will get there one day. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in my children's lifetime, but we will get there one day. And I think that is something that, you know, sort of basis of shared values, of we do not just ignore poverty, we do not simply say, in the Foucauldian sense of biopolitics, you know, the poor will always be with you. What are you going to do? The poor are the poor, right? It is a rejection of that mentality. It is, we can do better, right? And those redistributive mechanisms in Islam, like zakat, for example, the various forms of zakat, are immediately seized upon by Masyumi thinkers like Yusof Wibisono to say zakat can be a 2.5% wealth tax administered by the state into a Bait al-Mal that is owned and administered by the state, not to your local imam, not to, you know, whatever ulama you want to entrust your money to. It should be a centralized fund. It's basically wealth redistribution through taxation, right? Now, of course, this is theoretical, never got put into practice, but it is these possibilities that they dreamed up which I find important and compelling, and I see that compatibility of values, not just circumstances. Yeah. So in relation to your colleague who works in education, right, gentleman over there, I'm afraid it's a really good observation you point out about, and a very deep question actually, which I'm frankly not qualified to answer. The only part of your question I am qualified to answer is when you asked, well, how did I assess the societal response to these, like, you know, mixing of Islam and Marxism, and why it's so transgressive, right? You mentioned in your own experience with friends and family, this is not a conversation people want to have, right? And so I think this is one actually of the to answer the first question, did I assess a societal response? Not directly, no. I didn't make a quantitative attempt to interview people, right? Because after all, I'm a historian, and this book stops in 1965. So I didn't actually make an attempt to interview, I didn't make an attempt to rigorously interview people who lived through this period. But I did meet with several former PKI members who are living in exile in the Netherlands. And I'll give you one illustrative example, right, which I think is something that is very rare nowadays, and then I'll explain why I think it's rare nowadays. So one guy I met, I went to his house, right, and he was Harian Rakyat, the PKI newspaper. He was a cartoonist for Harian Rakyat. And so he drew like political satirical cartoons for Harian Rakyat. And he was very old already, he was well into his 80s by then, and his health was very poor. So we were helping him clean up the course, making lunch for him and all that. And I noticed that he had Quran. In fact, he had several Qurans on his shelf, in a kind of separate shelf from the Marxist literature. So in the same house, but different bookshelf. Yeah. So several different languages. The Quran is several different languages, and even a fair bit of tafsir, a few books on tafsir. And when I told him what I was doing, he immediately said, I didn't ask him anything. He said, "Saya Islam abangkan." Right? And that was his perspective. Is that we are specifically inhabit this particular mentality. And he told me he still reads the Quran. It's not weird for him. It's not something that he But no doubt, coming out of that revolutionary situation of cooperation, of the need for unity, and then of participating in a parliamentary democracy, right? This was a party that was basically a parliamentary party. It was not running an insurgency in the countryside, not until long after, much later, until 1966 in West Blitar. Until we get to that point, they are basically a parliamentary party. So this party was very responsive to Muslim concerns. And at one point, even goes on a campaign trail. I think this is in East Java. I can't remember where exactly. It's in my book somewhere. He goes on a campaign trail and he says to the audience that he's speaking at, I think maybe it was Garut actually, and he says, to vote for Masyumi is haram. To vote for the PKI is halal. We are the true Islamic party, right? Now, which sounds ridiculous to you today, but it's actually not entirely ridiculous in the context of the time. They were in a contest with Masyumi over what it means to be a good Muslim. And maybe what it means to be a good Muslim is to prioritize social justice, right? And of course, Masyumi would say what it means to be a good Muslim is to make Islam the national religion. But of course, then again, Kartosoewirjo would probably say that too, and that wasn't such a popular perspective, perhaps. So my point is that it was a genuine open question, right? And did it move the PKI and change its strategy and policy? Almost certainly. Almost certainly. I also want to point out to you a little fun fact that you may find interesting. When I was in the Institute for Social History in Amsterdam, I came across the letters that Darsono wrote to his son late in life. So this is in the 50s. And one of the things that Darsono writes to Alam, his son, right, who is, I think, blind by then already, actually, is he writes that all the things he's worked for have been corrupted. He says, the Soviet Union that I believed in, that I looked up to, is gone. It is so broken, right? And he says the PKI is just as bad. It's just like the Soviet Union. They haven't, they engage in a form of, shall we say, Marxist nation building that he finds wrong and distasteful. And I just bring up Darsono because I want to point out to you that Darsono also remained a lifelong Muslim, continued to be serious about his faith, and never abandoned his Marxist perspective as well. So there are many ways to approach that. I think there are many different people came to different ideas, came to different points, different conclusions about what mixing those two things might mean, what mixing Islam and Marxism might mean. The PKI came to a place of, well, we need the Muslim masses. We can't be talking about revolution, right? Darsono came to a place of, no, the Soviet Union is corrupt. It has destroyed what was once good and pure. So we need to find another way. So there's many different perspectives on how to mix those two. Right? Okay, so the last question from the gentleman up there was, what were the major points of contention? Which is a great question and really brings me back to the fundamentals. So one of the important points of contention was the atheism thing that the gentleman before you brought up, right? Is Marxism an atheist ideology? And this was something that got people really worked up. Like Natsir would get really worked up about this. He's like, atheistic, haram. But it's not quite clear how much this argument held water. Because if you look back to people like this, let me just pull up this slide. This guy, right? This guy is a ulama from West Banten, right? This guy is a haji, he's a kiai, he teaches at a pesantren, right? And he, just by being in the Constitutional Assembly debates, makes it very clear that this is not necessarily atheistic, right? So it's a matter of perception versus reality. We can talk about it at two levels. We can talk about it at a level of perception, in which case, yes, there were many people who said, oh, Marxism bad because atheism, right? And then there is at the level of reality, where is it necessarily bad? Is it necessarily atheistic? And I think the Soviet Union in particular did a really bad job of accommodating Muslims. You know, it accommodated them for like 10 years, 15 years, right? And then it was just basically will destroy Islam. And as a result, you know, news of this eventually filters out of the Soviet Union and people can see it for what it is. And so in reality, people do understand the Soviet Union is not friendly to religions, right? And they make certain assumptions based on that. So again, two levels, perception, reality. One of the big issues is religion. But there are also a bunch of other, I think, flashpoints. One of them is class struggle. To what degree is class struggle an accepted part of the political formula of the nation? Are we okay with saying the proletariat need to fight against the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, right? And you get a variety of responses, actually. Different people have different ways of squaring that circle. There are some like Natsir who says, no, class struggle is bad, disruptive, not good for any society. But there are some like Wibisono who understand the value of strikes, who understand the value of labor unions, and are very clear about that. Like, yes, unionize. Yes, strike if necessary. And if you want to know more about that, John Ingelson's book called Workers and Democracy, fairly recently published about the labor movement in the 1950s, is a very good introduction to those issues. Yeah, so I think those are the two main points of contention. It's is communism atheistic, and what do we do about class struggle? Yeah, these are the two main flashpoints. Thank you all so much. Great question.
Thank you very much, Suwan. It's already 2 hours, more than 2 hours actually. I actually would love to have, if there is a woman have a burning questions before we wrap up. Maybe anyone from the women participants. Yeah, I just want to highlight as well that Suwan's book also pay particular attention to the roles of women activists and women intellectuals that are rarely discussed in the discourse of Islamic movement or discussed separately. So just in case ladies over here would like to ask questions or response, but if not, or if you feel shy, we can talk to Suwan after the session ends. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Lin Hong Suwan, for taking the time. I'm sorry. Yes, to come here. Thank you very much for the Universitas Islam International Indonesia's library to host this and to organize this. Thank you very much again, Mas Gede, for the wonderful opportunities meet with you all and have a book discussion here. Thank you very much, Mas Azhar, for coming here and give your insightful response as well. And again, there's so much more to read and to grasp from the book Umayyad Proletariat. Please, if you would like to read, there already English version, but also Indonesian version, inshallah, will publish next year. And again, this is relevant and timely book, not only because talking about the confluence of Islam and Marxism, something that is rather avoided in the current discourse, but by looking at our history, I think it's important to look at the future as well, particularly since we are approaching the presidential elections and, you know, politics talking about the future and sometimes, you know, like dividing people into different ideologies, but not really what is ideologies and all the stuff. So having this kind of very enriching background, historical facts of the rarely discussed Islam and confluence of Marxism, I think it really shed a light of what is Indonesian politics and what makes us as a strong nation until today. So yes, hopefully you all happy and excited, and thank you very much again for your attendance. Let's give a big applause. Okay. Sure.
Check. Okay, maybe we can invite audience to take picture together with Swan, Mbak Rizky, and Mas Azhar ya. Terima kasih banyak.